In today's video, we will discuss if people like Joyce Meyer are deeply wrong and in sin for getting plastic surgery and altering their bodies. Firstly, I want to give props and I have respect for people like Joyce Meyer who have had plastic surgery and other cosmetic surgeries in the past and have ultimately opened up and owned it. There's many people out there in the Christian community who have done all different kind of work on their body but are too afraid to actually mention it. Now, I know this can be a very divisive topic. You're going to have people on both sides of the extreme. Now, the first thing I want to present, which I think is very beneficial to this, is we as humans, right, we don't have a problem, do we, when people take part in some sort of surgical procedure because some sort of attack or damage has happened to them. So for example, if someone's in a really serious car accident or in a scenario where people's faces are specifically targeted as a means of attack, we're not really going to look at people in that scenario who go and get plastic surgery done to basically reconstruct their face to give them a more appealing face based on how they ultimately got to that situation, right? As I thought about this more and more, these are some of the situations which really make a question like this extremely difficult, because the majority of people in the world wouldn't look at a scenario like that and say, oh no, you know what, there's no way, just deal with the face that you have now or deal with the body you have now because of the situation that somebody else has put you in. Now, I'm not trying to imply or just say straight from the get-go that just because in certain circumstances the majority of us will look at a situation and say, oh yeah, you know what, there's no problem with that, right? That is all that is just necessary. Now, there's even more common things which are even more acceptable to take, things like braces, things like doing eyebrows and different things along those lines. And this is something which women and men both take advantage of, and it's not necessarily heavily frowned upon, but they all would come under the category, some obviously more extreme than the others in regards to body enhancement. Now, even when you think about it like this, and this is another thing that makes it quite difficult, right? There's obviously levels, right? Most people are going to look at things like maybe a woman doing her eyebrows or a man basically using different grooming equipment to groom himself to look even better, or a man or woman taking part in getting their teeth done in whatever different way. We will look at levels to this, and then we'll obviously say something like cosmetic surgery is the extreme. And that in itself proves very difficult, because what basis are we determining what visual enhancements are acceptable and which ones are not? Can you see the difficulty? Now, the fact of the matter is, as Christians, we shouldn't be afraid of getting older or looking older, because at the same time, we know that at the end of the day, God has promised us new bodies, right, which will not wear out or not grow tired. But the fact of the matter is, there's a proverb that talks about the gray hair is the sign of basically wisdom and maturity, right? Many today, men and women, they get a few gray hairs here or there, and they basically turn around and like, no, like that's a bad thing. I need to basically dye it, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with dyeing your hair per se, but if intentionally in your heart it's because you're afraid of getting older or you're afraid of how people will look at you, that is where it becomes very problematic. But the fact of the matter is that there are Bible passages which basically tell us to celebrate our age and welcome our age, because it symbolizes and showcases maturity, that we've been doing this for quite some time. Now, one would think that what I'm going to say next only applies to women, but it doesn't, right? Because there's famous women and famous men in the Christian community who have both gone under the knife and done different types of cosmetic surgery. This is Proverbs 31, and the proverb talks about towards the end about how beauty is actually vain, but a godly woman is the one that will ultimately be praised, right? So it applies ultimately to women, and it would ultimately apply to men as well. But think about the first example I kind of gave you about when damage happens to you one way or another. Another example which comes up, right, is think about like a woman, for example, who may have had chest removal surgery because she's basically battling cancer or something along those lines. Are we going to say as Christians that, you know what, just get on with it, move on, don't get a job done on your chest to basically give you back what you'd lost previously? We're always going to have to weigh the intentions, and the difficult part about this is, as humans, we can't see people's intentions in their heart always. We can see their actions, but the actions don't always give us the full picture of one's intent. And this is very vital, speaking of intent, because in the Bible, in 1 Samuel 16, in the Old Testament, God says to the prophet of the day, Samuel, that he looks on the inward right? So God isn't necessarily looking at you physically and saying, oh, you know what, you look visually appealing, or you do not look visually appealing. I'm going to accept you because you look nice, and I'm going to reject you because you don't look nice. No, God is looking in our hearts. But the funny thing about this is, when I actually thought about this particular passage, it wasn't about God saying that he sees on the inward. It was actually the opposite side of what God says, where he says men look on the outward appearance. Let me give you an example before I continue, and make sure you stick around to the end, because we're going to talk about using church funds in regards to plastic surgery and cosmetics as well. So make sure you stick around to the end. Think about if you saw this fully sold out man of God, and he was basically preaching by a street corner in the most terrible clothing. He hadn't bathed. He looked very terrible, right? Certain people would listen and receive his message. Why? Because he's speaking a godly message. Many people, whether rightly or wrongly, will look at him, will hear him and be like, yeah, he might be saying the right stuff, but I don't like, there's a disconnect. I'm not justifying that kind of behavior, but just as God said in 1 Samuel 16, that men look on the outward appearance. Now you think about a man who's basically looking fresh, right? Fresh trim, fresh garments, speaking very polished, right? And is speaking the same message. We're not talking about on a spiritual level, but on a natural level, right? Merely on a natural level. The majority of people would be more receptive to that particular person than the person who was looking run down and looking beaten and busted up. That's just the nature of how we are. And that is what God is specifically talking about in 1 Samuel chapter 16. So we do things for God, yes, but God is obviously giving us the insight that this is how men view things. So it's in our interest at the same time to be as in line with God's will as we possibly can, and be trying to cater to our audience in different ways. This may be the most significant, because this is all about being made in the image of God. Should we as humans take what God has ultimately given us, we're fearfully and wonderfully made, as it talks about in Psalms, and start enhancing ourselves? Isn't that a sign of us looking at God and saying, look, you know what, God, what you've made for us, we don't actually like? Yes, you could be genetically gifted with good teeth, but you could do things which damage those blessed teeth that you ultimately were blessed with, and now you've ultimately got damaged teeth, which you're not in the image that God ultimately made you in. People that basically abuse cigarettes or abuse alcohol deteriorate their body in different ways. People that do other things deteriorate their body in different ways. That has nothing to do really and truly with being made in the image of God. Would it be okay in that scenario to try and take us back to what God has ultimately set up? Many young people especially are growing up, or have grown up previously, being bullied because of how they look, and they've got low self-esteem, and they're wondering, look, should they just change something? Should they just enhance themselves because of how people were ultimately treating them? Now, I would say first and foremost, firstly, think about this. Changing how you look isn't necessarily going to remove the damage mentally that those particular people may have done to you. There may be a more cheaper, easier alternative, things like potentially counseling, reporting those particular behaviors to higher ups in the school, talking about this stuff with your parents, etc. There's multiple viable options you can do before even getting to those kind of situations. But the most important thing is, like I said previously, as a Christian, God looks at us and determines our beauty, right? Not necessarily what other people are saying. Now, an example which is actually quite interesting from the Bible is a woman in the Bible, Queen Esther from the Old Testament. And when you read the early pages in Esther, it talks about how these women went through a 12-month process of beautification, different natural remedies and different items, right? Some translations even talk about cosmetics. But the point is, these women went through a procedure to get as beautiful as possible for the king. I want to talk about what I mentioned previously, which is what? Church funds, right? This is something, again, is this something that parishioners should basically be willing to accept from those who may be the pastors, the preachers in these particular churches, to use those kind of funds? I know, as I've mentioned previously, people like Joyce Meyer, who has openly come out and said, look, you know what, she's done different work, right? And the fact of the matter is, she was accused multiple different times, and there's articles about this and people doing different kind of things in these scenarios to basically call her out and say, look, she's using church funds to basically enhance her beauty and get into plastic surgery. Now, obviously, from my perspective, I can't say that was right or wrong, right? If in regards to her potentially doing that or not doing that, but the point is that is a very serious situation for us to discuss, right? Because if you are in the church, if you are even in a prominent position in the church, and you have access to church funds to delegate, to distribute and disperse that funds however you so please, you're going to have to be accountable, obviously to God, but also to your lay people, to talk about whether they are willing for you to spend that kind of money. Now, I'm not saying that's what Joyce Meyer ultimately did, but think about it from this perspective. It's easy from an optics perspective, just from visually, to look at this and say, well, yeah, like she's taking church money, but she's obviously, and other people who may be successful, don't only just preach or teach God's word. They do other things which allows them to basically garner income. If there was a leader in the church who was using church funds for this, it could be very problematic in many ways, because that is just about the visual appearance. Now, remember, we talked about earlier on about man looking on the outward appearance, and we can obviously take that into consideration, but it has to be weighed up. Is the money that's coming in best served for one individual to take part in some sort of beauty or cosmetic surgery, or for that to be spread out for a gospel message or gospel outreach in many different ways? And another thing I'll say in regards to this whole money situation is, whether it came from church money or it came from personal money, I'm of the opinion that, look, I don't think people should be struggling financially and trying to pay for stuff like plastic surgery, cosmetic enhancement. Why? Because on the balance of probabilities, your money can most likely be best served somewhere else. So what do you think about plastic surgery today? Let me know in the comment section below, and I'll see you on the next video.